So welcome to this evening's Scrutiny Committee meeting. First item on the agenda, minutes. Do I have your authorisation as Chairman to sign the minutes of the meeting held of this committee on the 7th of June 2021 as a quick record of those proceedings? Thank you very much. Apologies and substitutions. We have apologies from Councillor Earl Williams and Chairman of Council.
And Councillor Drayson, and also Malcolm Johnston, Chief Executive, and Tony Baden, Finance Manager.
Oh yeah. Unfortunately, Tony got pinged. He's perfectly fine. He's had all the tests, but he's been pinged. So I think there's some thoughts that he could come in, but others that he couldn't. So he's not here. So we're Robin instead. And we have a substitute this evening. Councillor Langland is in for Councillor Earl Williams. Additional agenda items, there are none. Disclosure of interest, I wouldn't think there's probably too much on there. Anybody needs to disclose an interest in? So, given that, we'll go on to item 5, draft revenue budget and capital programme outturn. Robin.
Thank you, Chairman. So this is the end of year outturn for 2021 financial year. And then in paragraph 3 of the report, it shows you that the council overall incurred a deficit of just under 1.3 million in 2021. And as we know, a fair chunk of that was obviously related to the COVID expenses and the recovery costs through grant from the government, which didn't quite cover it by about £500,000. There's tables on pages 2 of the report, which we can obviously come back to if members have got any specific questions on those. In terms of the actual spend on COVID, I think it's around 2.5 million we spent on COVID. We've got about 2 million back from the government. And that's set out in paragraph 5. There's a table there which shows you the changes between quarters. Tony's put that together, and so you can see how things have improved slightly, obviously, between quarter 3 and quarter 4. And overall, we were about 400,000 better off than we thought as a result of the COVID grants that we received. Paragraph 7 onwards gives members an explanation of the variations in the individual service areas. And obviously, if members have got any questions regarding those, I can pick those up after the presentation. The thing I'd like to focus on is impact on reserves. I think that's in paragraph 25 of the report. It shows you there that our reserve position actually is better than we expected by the end of the year, mainly because things improved in terms of the amount of government grant we received. So actually our call and reserves was slightly lower than we anticipated. And we have 13.2 million of earmarked reserves left at the end of the financial year. That's an improvement for us. Partly that's due to delays in capital expenditure, which we've reduced the call on reserves for the year, but also as a result of that overall COVID and other costs in our budget. There is a concern around the collection fund. Our recovery rates, obviously, as you'd expect, dropped off in the year compared to previous years. And for council tax, it was around 96.7%, 96.6% against budget. And for business rates, that was also down to around 94%. So overall, collection fund is in deficit by quite a considerable sum. It's 11.1 million, as shown in paragraph 28 of the report. Now, that's a in-year position for the collection fund. We have received grants which are not shown in the revenue budget that relate to that deficit, primarily around business rates. So we'll carry forward that grant into the forward years, and that will help cover off a fair chunk of that 11.1 million. I think council tax was around 1.2 million in deficit, which again is probably as expected given the fact that we were suspended any recovery action in 2021 as a result of COVID. We're reinstating that now, but we are collecting quite well this year. Our recovery rate is actually higher than previous years so far, so we're actually doing rather well. But we have probably got to ring fence that 2021 year and treat it as a very different year in terms of that overall level of debt that we might have to write off in the future. So that's something we need to watch. Let's say in terms of business rates, the fair chunk of the money, because the government gave reliefs to businesses, they took away their rate liability mainly for 2021, and therefore that income we received, and that will carry forward into future years and help us meet that deficit. The government also allowed us to carry forward that deficit over 3 years, so we can spread the cost and the impact upon the taxpayer over a longer period as well, and that's what we're all doing. So we're in consultation, obviously, with the County Council, Police and Fire, so they're fully aware of the position on that collection fund as well. In terms of the capital programme, again, I think you can argue that the COVID impacted on progress, and we spent some, though it still spent some 5.5 million, shown in paragraph 29, but that was quite an underspend on the capital programme as approved. One big area where we underspent was the slippage on the Mount View Street Housing and Commercial Development Scheme. That was about 4.2 million, although we are now progressing very well with that project, so that should happen this year. And a further delay on the land swap with the East Sussex County Council on the former high school site at Bexel, which we're hoping will go through this year. But overall, whilst we were in deficit, 1.2, 1.3 million, it was a better position for the year than we expected, which is good news. And obviously, our call on reserves was less than we anticipated as well, which again gives us a little bit more freedom for the future years in terms of meeting our financial plans and supporting the revenue budget as we expect. Questions.
Okay, thanks, Rory. I think it's probably worth mentioning, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the 11 million deficit on the business rates, we're not liable for that, because most of that is county council.
Business rates, we're 40%, although a lot of it is covered through, let's say, the grant that's been received, but will be accounted for in the next year. The government will pick up 50%, county I think is around 9%, and the fire 1%. So we do pick up the majority of business rate variations. Very different on council tax. Yes. We only get 10% of the hit on council tax, right, whereas the county gets 75% hit on the. So that's a very different position.
Okay. Any questions for Robin? Councillor Barnes.
Comment rather than question. I was looking at 25 paragraph. Effectively, the position actually meeting the deficit has actually worsened slightly. Where we've gained is on the slippage in capital spend. So unless we intend that slippage to be perpetuated into the future, we shall actually be slightly worse off than we were by 2024. But we're still anticipating we shall be in surplus in 2024, or not.
Chairman, that's the current MTFP, yes. I think what we're looking at is delays in things, and then so at the moment we are actually reworking our financial plan, take account of not only the impact of 2021, but also looking at capital programme spend, timing of borrowing, timing of repayments of borrowing costs, and timing of income. So it's a little bit in flux, I would say, at the moment, but everything seems to still point towards over a 5-year cycle, we should come back into surplus.
Yes, I think I was a bit worried about some of the housing developments, because in the long run, of course, they will be revenue producing. So when you find Mount View effectively made no progress at all in the year, I recognise this was down to legal difficulties, but clearly there's a lot of foregone council tax income at some stage in the future, which is going to hit us. The other one which really worries me, and Gemma's already alluded to it, is the longer term impact on business rates if there is a change of working practice and retail practice, because that's quite an important part of our income. So I think let's watch this space, but I'm not quite as optimistic, I think, as I would have been 2 years ago.
I think you're right, Gemma. I think it's right to identify business rates as a major risk area for the council's income going forward, not only through changes in working practices, but also through failure of business over the next year. So it's something we're all keeping a very close eye on. We're working on a particular project with the county police and fire, with the chief accountants. They're looking at how we're looking at how our forecasting processes are working. Also then feeding in the appeal process as well, because obviously the valuations of assets, properties, is coming down as a result of the changing working practices, and therefore we may see some appeals around rating values, which then ultimately will reduce the amount of income we can collect. So it is an area where we need to focus our attention on over the next year or so.
And the other area of concern is around our spend on homelessness. Again, our own provision of accommodation has slipped slightly, not as badly as some areas have slipped, but it has slipped. That's quite an uncomfortably high figure in that budget, isn't it, now that we're spending out?
So it's a budget that's very difficult to control overall, because obviously it's demand-led. We do our best. If you look a couple of years ago, probably 15 to 20 families in temporary accommodation at any one time. It's now more like the 80 sort of figure. So I think as we see the financial impacts of COVID sort of washing through, I think we then start to see whether those numbers start to increase as people start to struggle to pay rent or whatever it might be. So I think there's more to come on this, I think, in terms of difficulty and financial impact on the council. But clearly our programme to try and acquire our own resource in terms of accommodation should help us contain costs. If not, it won't reduce costs, I don't think, overall, but it may help us try and contain them as best we can.
I think it's probably worth mentioning number 15 as well on page 5. We had sort of less expense on repairs and utility costs across grounds maintenance, public conveniences, which probably due to the fact we couldn't open them. So they can't open them, they can't be smashed up, can they? And no one uses any water. But it cost us sort of 28,000 quid in increased clearing of fly tipping. And I suppose that's down to the fact that everybody was at home, so they all had a clear out, and then when they went to the tip, it was locked. So instead of taking it back home again, they stuck it down a country lane somewhere, didn't they? So unfortunate sort of byproducts there, I suppose. Kevin, you wish to say anything?
Thank you, Chairman. I think Robin summed it up nicely, and I think what Councillor Barnes said is very true. We just don't know what we don't know, and we don't know what the effect actually of everything is going to be in the long term. And the ship we're steering has got to be able to change course pretty rapidly, I think, over the next few years, because we just don't know the effects. Are we going to benefit from people not working in London and coming maybe working more locally in the nice area that we're in, or will actually people work at home and we do lose business in rather, it's a very difficult one. Is car parking going to be affected because people aren't going to be going out and using car parks, and that, which is our income, which is we do rely on very heavily. So it is difficult. It's a nice report, the fact that it's better than it was, and we're not in as bad a position, but I think we're less worse rather than better. It's probably the way it is, and we've got to be very, very reactive over the next few years to just try and work out how things are going to go. And I'd like to thank Tony, particularly in his absence, because he's done a good job in, I think, originally forecasting the worst case scenario, so that when we've come to this point at the end of the year, it's actually not quite as bad as we feared it could be. But that doesn't mean to say we need to write this year off as the COVID year and just say everything is related to COVID. I think we've got to now look at the trends going forward and seeing how we can get around it and how we can come out of this back in a surplus. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions, Councillor Langlands?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. I mean, I think with regards to the fly tipping, that's really interesting that was increased, and was it COVID, and will it continue if we reduce our bring sites? So it's an interesting one to watch, I think, because it might not be entirely due to a COVID situation. And it might just be entirely due to the fact that people are just having more online stuff and got more stuff to get rid of, as it were. So that's an interesting one. One of my also interesting observations was the reduction in the car parking income, because I think it was 188,000, wasn't it? And I think it's really nice to know, Robin, what the comparison is there. So what is our income to start with, and what would we be worried with that drop, or is that again a COVID-related drop and it could probably pick up quite nicely over the next quarter?
Thank you, Chairman. From memory, our budget for income is around 1.2 million car park activities. So it's a significant sum, but it's obviously in proportion against that overall 1.2. Yes, COVID has obviously affected the income for the year because the car parks were closed for significant periods of time. We also offered free parking for a period of time as well, from memory. So things should, in theory, bounce back. Obviously, if the weather's like this, and coastal town, and the office like Canberra, then we should see income levels increase overall, I would hope. But if things turn bad again in terms of COVID, then and other things happen, then clearly that may not be the case. So it's again one we need to watch carefully. But in the scheme of things, I thought it was a manageable sum of money that we lost at the end of the day, because it wasn't entire income, which would have been significant, and wasn't covered necessarily by government grant either. So that's quite important.
Can I just ask one more question? And that was the recovery cost due to the fact that courts were being closed. Can we assume that those costs will be recovered, or is that something? It was in in paragraph 5.
I remember. What it relates to is when we go to court, when we take people to court for non-payment of council tax or business rates, then we get a fee, obviously, to cover our costs of taking somebody to court. We haven't taken anyone to court, so we haven't incurred any costs. So the budget, which assumes a level of income and recovery, obviously wasn't achieved because we didn't take anyone to court.
Okay, thank you.
The courts are now open again, so we are starting to take action, and so our fees should start to rise. But there's a bit of me that thinks they're not going to achieve again maybe the total that we expect in normal times.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
On that second point, Robin, was it a decision? Was it a national decision not to pursue people for non-payment of council tax, or was it a local decision?
No, it was very much a local decision, reflecting the situation, and obviously the level of uncertainty most people were experiencing in terms of jobs and income. So we took the decision not to take action. But as you see, still 96% of people did pay, so it's very good. It's significant. We've put in a lot of time and effort in terms of that communication with people, including telephone communication, to re-engage them, so that when they're trying to recover the debts going forward, that at least there's some support from us. We can ensure that they're receiving the benefit that they're entitled to if they're not claiming. And extreme cases, also we've got the hardship fund as well available to help people. So the mechanisms are all there to help. Obviously, we've got a contract with CAB as well in terms of providing budgeting help and support. So there's Hastings Advice and Representation Centre as well, offering advice and guidance to people who are in arrears of council tax to help see whether they're entitled to any more help than they're currently receiving. So I think there's a whole package around people, I'd hope, that support them where they're struggling.
Okay. Councillor Mooney.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I'm always puzzled that the outturn that we're looking at now will be very different from the financial accounts, because usually these accounts show the worst case scenario, and the financial accounts come in, having been on audit for some time, well, home and dry. The financial accounts are due for finalisation in August. Have you any idea as to tell us how these compare, how the results compare with the financial accounts as drafted?
Thanks, Chairman. Obviously, we're still finalising the accounts at the moment. They're still in draft, so they'll be with the auditors shortly, and then we'll publish for audit committee at the end of July, so not a few days' time.
But, yeah, sorry, yes.
So overall, yeah, I mean, and as you know, Chair, it's very difficult to compare these accounts with these statutory accounts that we have to produce, mainly because of the number of entries that we have to push through.
True, yeah.
That then reversed out. So this is the real position, cash-wise, for the authority. The statutory accounts will show our profit and loss in a very different position, depending on profits or not profits, but changes in valuation on assets, for example, all sorts of things which are then burst out of our accounts and have no bottom line impact. So we can do, and if you look at the narrative report of the statement of accounts when it is published, you'll see that link between what you see here tonight and what you see in the statutory accounts. It gives you that information in order to do. I wouldn't want to go into the detail here tonight because I'd bore the tears off you. So I'd say this is more like our cash position, if you like. It gives you a clear view as to how we set our council tax as well. It's based upon how you set your council tax, and that's why within the statutory accounts, you put lots of entries through as you would in the private sector, but then are reversed out so they don't affect the cash position of the authority and don't affect the council taxpayers. So it's quite difficult, I find now, to try and work out how they all compare anymore. But this is the position you need to focus on as members, I think.
Okay. There's another question about, I know on page, at item 5, the review of significant unplanned variations, and he speaks there with regard to the effect of the pandemic response, etc. But I added up the figures now. I appreciate that there's figures lost in other areas, but brutally looking at the figures at top and bottom here on page 2, I get, very, very basically that we're actually still holding £339,000 in coronavirus money that is yet to be distributed. But in other words, basically all I've done is to take the top figures, starting with 45, on page 2, and 49, all those figures, added them up, got that 2474. Then I come down to the bottom part, and I get 2813, and the difference is 339. So we're better off. So one looking at this in a crude sense would suggest that we've got more money left in the kitty to distribute, but of course that's not so, is it?
Just to clarify, the figures in the top part of the table on page 2.
Yeah.
The figures that Tony has called out as COVID related or coronavirus related are the cost side of things. He hasn't shown necessarily the loss of income for the authority as well. So there's a bit of that to look at. And you've also got in the line there 1.3 million under housing, community and neighbourhood services. So overall, we have spent 2.5 million on COVID related spend. We've received around 2 million back from the government, from what I can recall. That's genuine, and if you think about it, that's probably about right, because they didn't cover all of our income losses as well. So.
Yeah, as I say, it's all in the makeup as described here, because this 427, of course, does what it's supposed to do. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fine.
Councillor Madeley, you indicate.
No, my question was not really.
Oh, Councillor Corsair.
My question relates to the overall position. It's quite impressive, I think, that the deficit has been reduced by more than half compared to the Quarter 3 forecast. And I realise that not all of that is costs which will be incurred in a future year. I'm struggling to understand Councillor Barnes's logic concerning the medium-term financial plan getting worse rather than better as a result of this. I mean, in terms of the impact on reserves year on year, perhaps I'm naively expecting it to improve, but I'd welcome your further clarification on that.
Paragraph 25 of the report and the table of use of reserves. If you look at the use of reserves to fund capital expenditure, that's 1.359 million in the budget, and we actually spent 477,000. So we spent less, or 882,000 pounds less than we expected to. But to balance the budget, which relates back to our medium-term financial plan, that was planned use reserves of 917,000, but we actually used 1.284 million. So we used 367,000 more reserves than we planned to. And what we need to analyse is how much of that 367 is ongoing and therefore increases the pressure on the financial budget going forward. The capital expenditure one is effectively a timing issue between years of when things are spent. But the real one you need to focus on is that reserves to balance the budget, which is increased from what we expected to use. But the majority of that will be the difference between what COVID spend we had and what grant we got back from government. So, but there might be some things in there that have ongoing impacts. So we need to do a bit more work on. That's why I say we're revising our financial plan to make sure that we pick up any of those. Particularly also, there might be some savings that we can pick up as well from the outturn work that we can carry forward. So there's more work to be done.
Robin, will the revision to the medium-term financial plan be presented to this committee once you've revised it?
That's planned for November meeting. I think it's in your work plan for October, but talking through with Tony, it's likely to come forward in November to give Tony a bit more time to bring the figures together.
Thank you, Chair. Robin, the £500,000 of coronavirus spending that we haven't had recovered, are we expecting that to be recovered at all by the government? Because obviously, certainly the impression you get from listening to the government sort of speeches is that any money councils have to spend, any money councils lose, will be reimbursed. Don't worry about it. We've got your back. And £500,000 is quite a chunk of money not to get back.
No, we think there's no more money coming through for us for 2021 year. They didn't promise ever to cover our loss of income, which is primary source of our spend. If you take out things like the leisure contract and the law pavilion trust. So they were agreeing to pay, I think it was 75% and 95% of your lost income, if you can follow that logic. So less than 100% anyway. So they haven't covered a particular chunk of our lost income, which I can understand some of that because some of it's not determined yet in terms of, say, commercial rent, for example.
Those income on investment properties as well, they're not going to cover that.
No, they certainly didn't cover any of the commercial activity the authority undertook in that sense. Our level of write-off so far has been fairly minimal on our commercial rents, but obviously we need to monitor that because there's obviously a level of arrears, but actual companies not being able to pay us is relatively low. So again, we're still watching what happens with our commercial tenants and making sure that we're all fully aware of when they're running into difficulties and we're in talks with them all the time through our estate department.
Good. Come back, yep.
Yeah, I need to say that obviously, and I know it's a political point, but there was obviously a time where we were getting money from government anyway, and I really don't like this, having to sort of beg for scraps and these sort of short-term ring-fenced grants that come and go and come and go. You never know what's going to happen the next year and the next year, which is the whole reason we have a deficit in the first place, is because 10 years, the money that we were getting from central government has disappeared, and now we're relying on taxpayers who haven't had pay rises in years, whose incomes are stagnating, who are struggling to pay their bills to fund the services we provide. I think it's a horrid situation we're in. But thank you, Robin, for being an incredible financial person.
Good. Councillor Barnes.
Chairman, Councillor Coleman's political point, the money we get from government, of course, comes from taxpayers. It's not a free gift. Whether the government were right to make local government live off its own resources and business rates, is an interesting debate we can have. But I get slightly worried when we talk about government money as if the government actually manufactures the stuff. If it does, it will lead to a major inflationary crisis. And I do remember the 70s, which is more than Councillor Coleman will, where the wage price spiral nearly bankrupted this country. We twice had to go to the IMF. It's not a great situation, believe you me. Just pointing out the obvious, I think, to Councillor Cortell, and I agree with Robin's answer. But hopefully the slippage of our contribution to capital is recoverable in a very short measure, because otherwise we are going to be in difficulties on the housing front. I'll come back to that perhaps when we talk about the work programme. But it worries me if we're trading that off somehow against the contribution to meeting the deficit, because that can only be a short-term, almost accidental fix. Helpful this year, but not helpful in the long term.
Kevin, you want to come back?
Thank you, Chairman. I'll rise above the political points and say that we, as an authority, we've done some things that we didn't have to do. We didn't have to support the Delaware. We didn't have to support Freedom Leisure. We didn't have to give free car parking in our car parks. We didn't have to give support to our tenants in our properties, but we did because it was the right thing to do. And 367,000 is the cost of doing the right thing. And that is ultimately what reserves are for. They're for the rainy days, and this has been a year of rainy days. And I think we just need to understand that, put it to one side, but take back to the point is the ongoing trend, and the changes from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic are the most important things that we need to look at. But I'd never, ever say that we were wrong in doing the right thing. And I think everyone in this room would agree with that.
Right, if that's all done then, the result of the report be noted. We need a mover and second on that, please. Councillor Cook to move it, obviously, and Councillor Langley second. All those in favour? That's good, that's carried, thank you very much. Item 6, items for consideration, possible themes for the work programme. Now, I've got some scrawling on here. Council tax reduction scheme. Did Tony mention that for September or August? September. Why
So,
get August?
Chairman, that's the response to the consultation process which just
That's it. That's it. Yeah. Okay. And off-street car parks. Is that around about early next year? January. Yeah. Okay. Good. So we're all pretty happy with that. Next meeting, post-COVID recovery plan, review of environment strategy, question mark. Performance report, first quarter, revenue budget, capital programme monitoring, and then October, summer will be gone by then. If it ever turns up. Medium-term financial plan, review of environment strategy on there. So where are we with the environment strategy?
I'm sure there will be coming forward from Deborah as the lead, as the head of service related to that area.
Yeah. All right. Well, would we? She's not going to get it for September. Yeah. It's also I've got it twice on mine. Put it on 13th of 9. 10. So one of them we can take out. Right, go for October on that. We've got items for consideration as listed: regeneration of sports centre, fountain, skate park, corporate plan review, review of tourism, review of economic regeneration strategy, peer review, annual review of homeless strategy, draft anti-poverty strategy proposals, draft corporate customer services strategy proposals, litter strategy, progress on the environment strategy, impact of Airbnb and second homes, Rye Winch housing in Canada. Should we put planning on there? Should we consider planning?
Chairman, you've added it, I think, to your performance target list, haven't you, in terms of monitoring that. So that would probably be the appropriate mechanism for receiving reports regarding planning performance. Whether or not you need to have a specific review of it is I think, dependent on how those
figures are.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So will we get those figures at the next meeting?
So that'll be part of your report, as I understand it. Yeah. Then,
yeah. All right. All right. Well, that'd be a good start. Councillor Cook.
Can I just ask a question about the draft corporate customer services strategy proposals? Is that because there is a draft strategy being worked on, or is that for us to work on?
as I understand, there is a strategy being prepared, so it'll be a draft one for members to consider, as far as I'm aware.
Who's going to be in charge of doing that?
So that'd be Joe Powell. As head of customer services as well as housing communities. Yeah.
And Councillor Barnes.
Yeah, the housing task force generated really two quite distinct aspects. We've now got the homelessness strategy, and quite properly we're going to review that. But we were promised a second paper on some other aspects of housing, and it becomes, I think, even more important in the light of our statutory document, which we've just submitted yet again, showing that we don't meet the land supply targets because of build-out rates and things like that. I do think, therefore, housing as a topic, as opposed to homelessness, which is very important, but I think we do need to have a session on the other side of that housing task force review, and perhaps look at the document we've just submitted to the government on effectively the housing target and our failure to meet it. We're doing quite a lot now with Alliance Housing to start to meet that gap. There are various other things we're doing, but I think we do need to understand where we're going on that and what's happened to some of the recommendations, which weren't really about homelessness. So I think that should be in the work programme.
Yeah, I think that we had a training session a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was mentioned there that if we have, say, a working group or a task and finish group, we report, should we 6 months, 12 months later get a report back to actually see that what we've found out is being progressed? Otherwise, there's no point doing it. That makes sense? Did I describe that correctly?
That is correct from my memory. Yeah, and it's sensible. Obviously, there was a number of recommendations and an action plan that came out of the Housing Task and Finish group, so it would be reasonable that members have an update as to progress against those actions and targets. So.
Good. Anybody else? Councillor Coleman.
Two things. First of all, I heard from Joe Powell about the anti-poverty strategy, and that's looking to come back to scrutiny with a draft strategy to go out to consultation in March, on the 14th of March in 2022. So have that in your diaries. And the other thing is it worth having a look at I believe it's the Bexel Town Centre strategy? I know pre-pandemic, I think even pre this administration, there was quite a bit of money spent within the remit of Bexel Town Centre. Although, you know, the if you can call them shelters, and a lot of the stuff on the seafront, I think it'd be worth looking at that. Spending, perhaps, if there's any room in the work programme.
I think it was probably, would that have been, there was various things, was business related, wasn't it? And there was the shop fronts and the Edwardian stuff, wasn't it?
There was a town centre steering group, wasn't there? I have to admit, I never attended the town centre steering group, so and however, whether it come to an end in terms of the process. So if you let me take that one away to have a look at where we're at with that particular group and what its next stages were or next steps will be.
Would that be something that would sit with the town council?
That obviously adds a layer of change, if you like, in terms of the role of such a group, whether it has a continuation or not. I expect probably not, but there may be certain aspects of the activity undertaken by the town centre steering group that members want to review carrying on.
Yeah, because there was sort of, I think there was something, was there something underneath the railway bridge trying to tidy it up or something?
I mean, a lot of it was to do with obviously the money that was available through the 106 money we received, where £100,000 was allocated towards town centre. I think Ben has taken a report previously to Cabinet regarding residual money from that. So again, that might be something to see what's happening.
Right, and we'd better put down in your poverty for the market. Right, Councillor Barnes.
Looking also at the progress on the environment strategy, it's a bit hard to evaluate progress if you haven't established a baseline. I've yet to see a baseline for this authority, let alone rather. Could we actually fairly urgently have a figure for the baseline? I think it's a proper thing for us to do and to scrutinise that. It may be more difficult to do for the whole of Rother, but we should be able to do it for this authority. And it will be useful then because we can then start to quantify progress instead of simply looking at it.
Yeah. Councillor Gray, I'm sure you've got something to say on this.
Yes, indeed. I can assure you, Councillor Barnes, that it is the top of the agenda to measure the carbon footprint, not just of this building, but throughout Rother. Because until we know what our output is, we can't begin to address it.
Good. Councillor Dixon.
Thank you, Chairman. I know that Tony Baden's going to be doing some work on reserves. He was telling me the other day. I don't know whether that will be a separate report or coming in with some of the others. Robin might be able to advise, but that will come across the committee's desks. And in your bottom of your items for consideration, we've got the review of the tourism strategy, which I was involved in a while ago, which I know we've obviously not been able to do because there hasn't been any tourism. But at the bottom there, you've got impact of Airbnb and second homes. Well, during the tourism strategy, we did do quite a lot of work on Airbnb, and there were some recommendations out of that I don't think have gone anywhere yet. So you could well put those two items together. Second homes is a bit of a different story, but you may well want to put those two together when you do the tourism strategy review.
Yeah, I think that's an idea. I do have sympathy with that item there, to be honest. It seems ironic that last year and earlier this year I converted two very small, miserable flats that a chap I know owned. They only ever, because they were so small and miserable, they'd only ever get very short-term lets. And I said to him, you ought to go Airbnb on these. I said, they're spot on. We can do them up. We can sort them out, get them instated, and they only need to be somewhere in there for a few days because they're not big enough to sort of live in. So that's what he's done. So and he's actually rammed out with bookings, so he's well happy. But there is a concern that there's so many places that you hear of and you see, perfectly, large houses that there's no one in. There's one opposite me, and it's hundreds of pounds a night. And there's people in there all the weekend, but there's never anybody sort of living there. and it's I know it's, you know, it brings income into the area, you know, and everything else, but to me, an empty house just seems wrong. I know it's a large house. I'm sort of more concerned over, you know, people buying semi-detached houses now that families would live in, and they're being priced out in Rye, especially being priced out of semi-detached houses, and then you just see them on Airbnb and holiday cottage rentals. And you just think, is that right? Is that right? I don't know. And then they want them serviced, but there's no one can afford to live in the town to actually service the party. So I don't know. You know, I suppose if people make money out of it, but then is that what it should be? I don't know. Difficult. But I know in Canberra, I think there's White Sands, there's 180 odd houses, and during the election, go down there to sort of do your electioneering, and you literally got about 45 houses on this whole estate that are lived in. So it doesn't take you 20 minutes to do it. Go to anything, all right. 180 houses, here we go. And there's literally about 45 of them lived in. And the rest of them are all second homes and holiday homes. It just doesn't seem right. It doesn't help our figures, for, you know, especially when Robin says we've got people in temporary accommodations.
We should be looking at tourism fairly soon. I think Councillor Dixon's right. They should be looked at the same session, because they're the two halves of the same coin, aren't they?
Yeah. And the other sort of thing that really sort of bugs me a bit is they get bought by a limited company, so then they then sort of opt out of council tax. Then they register it as a single business, so then they get small business relief. So they don't pay any business rates, don't pay any council tax. So our income goes down, and the people coming down still want the services. So then you can see that the rubbish gets put into our roadside bins or anybody else's bin, and and we're paying for it, and the services aren't there. And then if you was to mention, oh well, let's put a £3 a night tourist tax on people, they'd fall over themselves like it's the end of the world. But you've just paid 190 quid to stay somewhere, but you're bothered about £3 that actually goes into the local economy to clear up your rubbish and keep the streets clean and keep everything tidy. You know, when I go to, well, if I ever go back to Switzerland, we paid €2 a night tourist tax. Well, I'm not going to not go because I'm €14 a year. But all the 30,000 people a week staying there, that gives the town a big chunk of money that they then keep the place tidy and clean and sweet and everything nice. And that's, you know, but if you mention tourist tax in this country, you're the thing of the devil. But people pay, you know, opposite me, they pay 700-800 quid a weekend. But you couldn't get an extra £3 out of them for tourist tax. Funny world. Councillor Courthouse.
I like your idea of tourist tax, Councillor Osborne. Could I ask Robin, can a local council introduce a tourist tax?
As far as I'm aware, Councillor, no. Well, I haven't looked at it into any detail, but you could probably have a voluntary or a donation type scheme, but maybe not a mandatory scheme, as far as I'm aware.
Thank you.
Councillor Cook.
Thank you. Who would be the head of service for tourism and this kind of proposal and discussion?
That'd be Ben Hook.
So is this something then that perhaps we could add to the October programme?
Can you let me take that away in terms of capacity? Because obviously there's a lot of items in the items for consideration, which will involve primarily Ben Hook and Joe Powell. So I'll ask them about their capacity to deliver on when they can deliver, report to members.
Thank you.
Okay. I think you're looking probably at more the spring for tourism, because by the time the figures come through for a tourist season, you're into the next year at that point. If you did it that early, I think you'd be only looking up probably up to the pandemic. Certainly not beyond May when we opened up.
Okay. Good. So,
Yes, I would urge we take
yeah. Yep. Yeah.
my sense.
Good idea. Yep. Okay. Is that it? Right. I think that's it. So I'll declare this meeting closed at 7:20. Thank you very much.